Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first live episode of Homework Hotline, the show with all the helping hands and all your homework needs. I'm your host, Isaiah Gira, and we have teamed up with some special tutors who will be helping us run this show.
All right. Over on the gym, I have two warm-up questions that we're going to start off with. And they're pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You might go over them with the other two tutors, but so far we have factoring here, and it's just going to be the X method is the method I like to use the best. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. You're basically going to take your last term, put it on top, and then your middle term and put it on the bottom, and whichever multiples you can put to add together to get the bottom term, those are the multiples that you're going to use when you're factoring. So for this one, for example, it would be -5 and 10, right? Because those multiplied together equal -50, and those added together equal 5. So how would we write this? Well, when we're writing it in factored form, it would just be x minus 5 times x plus 10. It's a really simple way of writing it because you already have your numbers, so you don't really have to convert them like in a few other forms. So yeah, and this method really helps in the second problem because it gets a little bit harder. For your first degree, your first coefficient here, you have a coefficient greater than 1, so you have to do a little bit more work. So basically, you're going to take 8 and multiply it by the last one. And if you have Miss McKittrick, she went over this in depth, so this is probably a really easy way to do it. But if you have another teacher like McGivney, she never really taught us this way. It was kind of a different way, and I didn't understand it. So if you guys didn't understand it and you just need a refresh, this is like definitely the way to do it. So then you're gonna bring 2 on the bottom, and then which two numbers multiply to get -80, but then add to get 2? That would be -8 and 10. And then you have to add one more step because you can't just finish with that. Your last step is gonna be the box, the infamous box. A lot of people use because we're still going over it, but yeah, you basically take x coefficient, which is 8x squared, and then you take your second term. You can take either term, but we're just going to start with this one, and that's going to be -8x. It doesn't matter which one we're in though. And then your next term, which is this, so 10 is going to be in this box. And then finally, you're going to have your last term over here, this -10, and bring it to the bottom. And then from here, you basically factor, but going outward. So you're going to look at the first top row, right? And I guess we can like kind of do this in a different color. Quirky, okay. And then you're going to pull out the greatest factor you can. In this term, it would be 8 because 8 is the highest, like it's in both of them. So it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And then you can also take out an x, right? Because they both have an x. So this will be 8x. And then on the top, looking just this way, you can see that there's, oh, the colors are, okay, it's okay. You can see like the greatest one that you could take out after having an 8 on this side would be a 1x, or you could just write that as x, it really doesn't matter. But you know there's a 1 there. And then going straight down, you have 8x squared so far. And then this at the bottom is just x, so then you would take out a 10, and that's going horizontally. And then finally, you would go vertically again on the last end, and this, the highest you can take out, would just be a -1, right? Because you're multiplying -1 times 8 to get -8, and then -1 times 10 to get -10. So the way you would write this, again, why I really love this method is because it's so simple to look at. The way you would write this is just take the ones that you've pulled out, and I look kind of overlapping, but that's totally fine. And then you would just write those in the same factored way. So it would be, scratch that, x minus 1, and then your final part there would be 8x.
All right, that seemed very easy. Thank you for explaining. You're going to move into your practice questions. Now, of course, if you guys have any questions, you guys can drop them in the Twitch comments and we'll have them answered. Sarah can answer. Sarah?
So the question is f of x is equal to x times x minus 3 squared, right? And it's asking to state the degree, zeros, and multiplicity. So when we're looking at degrees, the easiest way to look at this is as if there's a 1 right here. So x to the first power is going to be a normal linear function, right? So you're going to take 1 and then add it to your second degree right here, which is just going to be 2, and that's going to give you a whopping 3. So the easiest way to think about this is, well, what is 3 stating? Like, what is the graph going to look like if I have a power of 3? And that's basically the S-type graph. So you know it's going to go from the bottom and go up. So whenever you think 3, just think this, because that's the universal graph for odds, versus the even one would just be like a U, which we normally see. So those are the degrees. And an easy way to remember how to graph this is knowing that your odd degrees are going to give you a cross. So that's going to be cross. And then your even degrees, like 2, right, 4, 6, those are going to give you a bounce. So that's how you're going to graph it. Those are like really important. You really just have to memorize that, because that's basically how you're going to know how to graph this entire thing. So yeah, so bounce, cross, and then how are we going to find out where to bounce and cross? Okay, I hope you said find your zeros. So yeah, basically you find your zeros, which is the second part of this, and x for the first one, there's nothing there, so you really aren't going to do anything with it. It's just going to equal 0. And then the second part, x minus 3, you have to set that equal to 0, right? So x minus 3 is going to be equal to 0. And then you basically just add on both sides. You don't have to show that process, but that's what you're doing. You're just adding. So add 3 to both sides, and that gives you 3. So this is like the part of the graph where you're going to end up crossing and bouncing. So our first one is 0, right? And that multiplicity. That multiplicity is 1, which basically means we're going to cross since it's odd. So the way we graph this is pretty straightforward. You would just start from the bottom, because remember, this is the way it's going to look. So we use that as our rough outline. So you start from the bottom, and then you cross at 0, right? And then you have to get that S shape, and you know that your next point is 3, so you can kind of like mark it on your graph just so that you can kind of see where you're gonna have to go. So you go up through 0, bounce at 3, remember, because bouncing is for an even multiplicity, and x minus 3, the multiplicity is 2, so that's even. So then you just bounce at this part, and then you go straight up. This looks a little janky, but that's totally fine, because that's the way your graph is going to look.
I think that wraps up our 10 minutes for you, Sarah. But thank you so much for teaching us about graphing and factoring. For now, Vincent.
So let's head on over to this Jamboard, and let's just get a quadratic thrown up here. All right, so we have this quadratic here, 6x, x squared plus 6x plus 8. So first step we do here, right, we set up our cross, like she said. And we are going to do our C term. The top of our cross is our C term times the coefficient of A. So our C term is 8, coefficient of A is 1. So it's just 8 times 1, which is 8. Bottom of the cross, we're going to take our coefficient of B. Put that there. Now we have to get 2 numbers that multiply to 8 and add to 6. If you're struggling with stuff like this, you can put on your side your factors, so 1 times 8 or 2 times 4. Obviously, this is pretty self-explanatory. It'll be 2 and 4. And then the standard way to do this would be to set up our box, but I'm just going to go over this quick. Right? So we set up our box, and we have 4 squares. We're putting a term in each of the squares. Our top left square is going to be our A term. So right here, it's just x squared. In our bottom right box, going to be our C term, which is just an 8. And the 2 other boxes would be basically our B term, but we split it up into 2 and 4 in our cross. So we write our 2, and remember, we take our variable with it. So it's 2x for x. X. Easy. And then here, if we're going to look at our first column here on the left side, so the x squared and the 4x, in order to get our factors, we take the GCF. So the GCF of x squared and 4x is just x, so we write it up top. And we take the GCF of that, which is just 2. Now we look at the top row, the x squared and the 2x. GCF of that is just x. And we do our bottom row, 4x and 8, GCF of 4x and 8. Our factors would be x plus 2 and x plus 4. And you can see that these are the same as we got in our cross, which means this is a shortcut. So whenever the coefficient of A is 1, you can use the shortcut. All you have to do is the cross.
All right, Vincent, you were an awesome tutor. So much for reviewing us more Algebra 2. So we're going to jump to our break, and we'll be going to Graciela.
That it is not in its fully factored form. So the first thing we have to do is factor this out. So we have to see if there's anything in between. If there's anything in common between all of these variables, and as we can see, we can take out x2 from each of these variables. So now let's factor this out. So after removing x2, our new equation is going to be as follows. It's going to be x to the second power, parentheses, x to the second power minus 2x minus 3. So that's going to be our first step. And then after this, we need to factor it even further. As we can see, this inside part of the parentheses isn't fully factored. So let's work on that right now. So as we can see from both of these, we can factor it to be x minus 3, parentheses, x plus 1. And we also don't want to forget this x squared that we took out, so let's include that in another parentheses right here. And that is what we have. So when it comes to rational inequalities, we have to find the zeros of each factored part of the equation. So let me set that up right now. So, and that solves to x equals 3. And now let's go to the second equation. So it's x plus 1 equals 0, and then that x is going to be equal to -1. And then finally, our last equation, which is x to the second power, set it equal to 0. You know, you can't divide anything or multiply anything by 0. It'll just equal 0. So our last answer is just simply 0. So as I mentioned, when it comes to solving rational inequalities, our first step is making sure that our inequality equation is going to be factored out. So as I did right here, these steps, I'll circle it to make it more known. As I did in these steps, I first factored our equation, and then afterward, I found the zeros, which is needed to finally start figuring out our inequalities. So I'm going to move on to the next step. So when it comes to inequalities, what you're going to have to do is use a number line. And you're going to add your zeros onto that number line. So I'm going to add the -1 that we found. I'm going to add the 0. And finally, I'm going to input 3. So when it comes to rational inequalities, what you need to do is find a number, test a number in between each of these numbers. So in between -1 and 0, we have -1/2. And then in between 0 and 3, we have 1. And beyond 3, we have the number 5 could be used. It can be any number beyond 3, and then it's same thing goes for this -1. It could be any number beyond -1, but I'm just going to choose -3. Okay, so now what we would do is we would test these additional numbers that we put in. So we would test -2, -1/2, 1, and then 5. We would test these numbers to check if they make a true or false statement when it comes to our inequality. So what you're going to do is just simply plug in these numbers into our original equation. So I'm going to put -2 to the power of 4 minus 2 to the multiplied by -2 to the power of 3, and then 3 -2, and then to the power of 2. So now you would simply just plug in this, solve this, and your result should be 20. And then now this is when you're finally going to consider that inequality. So it's going to be greater than 0. So as we can see, -2 works because this results in a true inequality. So that's this first part, and I'm actually going to go and erase this really quickly so we can plug in our next numbers for this. The last number I'm going to just put in is going to be that 5. So we're just going to plug in 5 into all of these. And then you do the same process, you solve for everything. And as you can see, our answer is actually going to be 300 is greater than. So from these two sides, the inequality is going to be true. And that's how you would essentially go over rational inequalities.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gracie, for your lesson. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Vincent. You guys did an awesome job, and it was amazing to have you guys on the show.